We're going to start. So, good evening, everybody. Can you hear me? Yes. Yeah. Okay, good. Thank you for coming. I'm Rhoda Shermer, and I welcome you on behalf of the Network for Responsible Public Policy. And I want to thank you all for coming out on this nasty little night. And I want to thank you for donating tonight because you've helped defray the cost of tonight's program. And I want to do a special shout out to the League of Women Voters of Fairlawn because of their continued support for our program. So shout out to the League of Women Voters of Fairlawn. Yeah. So I have to tell you guys, we've been in business 10 years. Can't believe it. It's actually been 10 years. And when we started, what did we want to do? We wanted to make and help democracy flourish. And we thought the two pillars for that was to have credible, reliable information, like the programs tonight and the programs we have done over these past years, and to motivate civic engagement. So here we are. We're still in business, 10 years, with a wonderful track record of great programs, which if you go to our website, and you've missed many over these 10 years, they're still relevant with great speakers, trusted sources, and you can enjoy watching some of the past programs. So we're going to get ready to go into 2020, and we will still need your support. We'll still need you to pass the word about us. We'll still need your donations. We'll still need you to volunteer in any way that you can, short-term, long-term, whatever. So thank you for all you have done. Thank you for helping us reach our 10th anniversary. So tonight's program is the last program at FDU for this year. We'll be back in 2020 in January, but we do have 3 more programs coming up. One will be on November 14th at the Ridgewood High School, and that will be with David Becker, who will talk about foreign interference in our elections and other voter issues and voter fraud issues and what have you. Then we have a program on November 20 at Englewood Library, and that will be on racism and reparations. And then our final program for the year will be at Teaneck Library, and that will be on the Electoral College. So check our website. You'll be updated on all the programs, where they are, and at what time. And I hope to see you. So we're going to get started tonight with one of our favorite people, David Cay Johnston, and Peggy LaScala, our issues coordinator, will introduce him. Thank you for being here.
Hi, good evening, everybody. Welcome. I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker this evening. David Cay Johnston is a Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative reporter and former president of Investigative Reporting and Editors, IRE. He teaches at Syracuse University College of Law and is familiar to many as a frequent guest on MSNBC, CNN, the BBC, NPR, and other shows. He has served as a consultant for the Netflix series House of Cards, and Mr. Johnson has lectured on economics, journalism, and tax policy on every continent except Antarctica. Okay. He is the best-selling author of numerous books, including The Making of Donald Trump, and Mr. Johnston's current book will be available for sale after the program. We welcome him again to the NFRPP.
Okay, so thank you very much. I called this talk The Tyrant Next Time because I want people to understand that what we're going through in America today is not the disease, it's the symptom of a disease. And there are 2 words I want you to keep in mind. These are words that I use in my courses at Syracuse, where for 8 years I taught the law of the ancient world. One of those words is idiot. Now, in modern language, we think of an idiot as someone who is stupid or a fool. That is not the classical meaning of that word. An idiot is someone who cares only about himself and has no regard for anyone else. And that's terribly important when you think about tyrants. Now, we think of tyrants as people who are horrible. They are oppressors. In fact, in its classic historic meaning, tyrant was simply someone who seized power. They could be a horrible person like Draco, from whom we get draconian, who said that the penalty for, when he was asked, why do you make the penalty for stealing an apple death? He said, well, because I think that's the appropriate penalty. Well, what about murder? Well, I can't think of anything worse than death, so it's death. The other word I want you to think about besides idiot is this word tyrant and what it means to seize power. Now, the founders of this country are in two groups, and we don't generally teach that. Just as I mentioned when I spoke here the last time, we live in the Second American Republic because the First American Republic under the Articles of Confederation failed because it had no power to tax. And a government that can't tax, a government by bake sale, is no government at all. I tell more conservative audiences, that the reason we created the Constitution was to tax ourselves, that people become apoplectic in the room. And I just point out it's Article 1, Section 1 of our Constitution. The Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, and imposts. By the way, occasionally I get some idiot who goes, oh, see, the income tax is illegal because Congress doesn't collect it, the IRS does. Which will be relevant to what I'm going to talk about. Governments throughout history have been run by tyrants. They may be long-lasting hereditary tyrants, and they may be bizarre tyrannies. I mean, think about this. At the equivalent of a modern diplomatic cocktail party 3,000 years ago in Memphis, not Tennessee, but Memphis, Egypt, the representatives of the Philistines and the Turks and the other people, they would stand around, if you believe Herodotus, the original gossip columnist, and they would go, these Egyptians, I mean, really? They think God is a person with a dog's head and other bizarre thoughts? And they would mock them and make fun of them. But whose society lasted 3,300 years? It was the pharaohs. 3,300 years. Now, there are some geographic reasons for that, and there are some smart reasons for that, one of which was they figured out through public works how to keep people busy and out of trouble, and every highborn Egyptian was taught about how far you can oppress people before they will strike back. And so they learned how to modulate this, and they did from time to time have rebellions and riots and responses. And they also learned one other lesson. You've all heard of the Rosetta Stone? I was the tax reporter at the New York Times. I kept a little model of it from the British Museum on my desk at work, and I kept one at my desk at home. Anybody know what the Rosetta Stone actually says? Well, if you go to the British Museum, there are like 8 books for as much as £100 about the Rosetta Stone, none of which have the text. But there was a little one when I was there for like £4, and it had the text and it explained it. The Rosetta Stone is a grant of tax relief. That's why they went and put it in the wall of the village so nobody would forget. And essentially it says, the Egyptians were very flowering about the things they wrote about. I, Pharaoh so-and-so, as the wonderful leader of the people who has done such wonderful things for them, in expression of my gratitude for the priests of this village, ensuring the fealty of the people to my administration, hereby make this grant of tax relief to these priests. Everything old is new. Now, what's happened in our society is we have seen this experiment, this crazy idea of self-governance, which had very few antecedents, atrophy. Anybody know what the oldest democracy we know of in the world was? It was right near here. I live in Rochester, New York on Council Rock Avenue. And if you go look, you will find there are Council Rock streets all over Ohio, Massachusetts. The Haudenosaunee people, the people of the Longhouse, the ones we call the Iroquois, created a democracy. It stretched at its height from Nantucket Island to Toledo, and its national capital was Onondaga, Syracuse. But they had the equivalent of state legislatures, and the Albany of Western New York is at the end of the block I live on. Ugly rock. I don't know why anybody picked that rock. It's really ugly. Well, and in that democracy, by the way, only men ran for office, only women voted. And women could remove from office men who misbehaved, and they did. Now, the Haudenosaunee people will tell you, that their democracy is 3,000 years old. I tend to think there's good reason to believe that, but here's what I can tell you as an absolute fact. It existed on August 13th, 1183, because of an astronomical event. I hope I got the date right. An astronomical event we know about on that day that's in their lore. So while people in Europe were living in horrible conditions under brutal warlords and dukes and predatory aristocrats, these people had a functioning democracy. The other old democracy, the one we know about, and the one I teach about a lot, was in Athens. Now, Aristotle said democracy means to rule and to be ruled in turns. He said that because the system the Athenians set up was designed to ensure that nobody would come and seize power. So they took people and divided them into different tribes. They then forced them to be political units composed of multiple clans, they would say, sociologists would say not tribes. So different clans had to be together. You couldn't be segregated. And they had a 10-month calendar, and every month a different group was in charge, hence to rule and to be ruled in turns. And this was a mechanism to prevent someone from seizing power, and it worked for 200 years. Our Constitution is based a lot on the experience of ancient Athens, of Attica. All of the founders of this country, both the signers of the Declaration of Independence and then the small number of them who were also framers of our Constitution, were well steeped in the history of the ancient world. Even the drunks knew this stuff because that's what you learned back then. You didn't have video games and television, and so they learned all this stuff as the aristocrats of America. And they were very concerned about the rabble. They were concerned about people being inflamed and making bad decisions and ruining this idea they had. And they had lots of ideas we might find either quaint or offensive today. For example, what do we call the county legislatures in this state? Boards of freeholders, because in many places you weren't allowed to vote if you were just a wage earner. The theory, and this came out of the horrible patroon system of the Dutch in Hudson Valley, where ordinary people would be told by their boss who to vote for. And they had very strong sheriffs, and they were very corrupt, and they were totally focused on maintaining power. But if you were a freeholder, the idea was nobody could tell you how to vote and what to do. Well, if you look at our Constitution, it is designed to be slow and hard to change. It takes 6 years to get rid of all the scallywags in office today. You can get rid of the whole Congress in 2 years, the president in 4, and the Senate, because it's in 3 parts, is going to take 6. To get an amendment to the Constitution, you got to get 38 states to vote for it. So it's designed to be conservative, and it has a very interesting backstop. A backstop that, to the extent that we still teach civics in school, and we don't seriously, because I speak to a lot of high school and college classes, and man, what the young people in this country don't know that we learned, those of us with gray hair in school, about government and the Constitution and civics, you could fill an ocean of ignorance with. They put in this thing, the Electoral College, which is taught as, oh, that was a way to make sure the slave-owning states had more power. 3/5 of a person, said James Wilson, who created that compromise, one of the delegates from Pennsylvania, and by the way, a man who was arrested while a sitting justice of the United States Supreme Court. The Electoral College has a second purpose, the one we've forgotten about, except for 6 people who exercised that power in 2016. It was to have an ultimate backstop if the people went for a zealot or a crazy person to be president of the United States. It was the ultimate backstop. That you would vote your conscience and you would say, no, the popular will here is wrong. This person will destroy our democracy. I'm not going to vote for that person. Now, some states have actually passed laws taking away that franchise. No one's challenged them as being unconstitutional, and it might be difficult to do so because the language of the Constitution doesn't say what we know from the limited records of the debate and from the Federalist Papers, and subsequent to that, the writings, and there's lots of them by the various framers of our Constitution. Now, the concern, though, was what happens if we get someone like King George? And remember, when we broke away from England, we literally had a crazy man in London telling us what to do. We know today he had a particular disease, and it made him insane. In many ways, he could appear to be reasonable and normal. And surprise, surprise, the king was taking care of his best friends. One of the motivating things that got us our independence, we teach as the Boston Tea Party. Right? And these anonymous, unknown people dressed up as Mohawk Indians went and threw tea into Boston Harbor. Well, you can go to London and go to the British Library, not the British Museum, and you can read who they were by name. The Brits knew who they were, but it's sure been convenient for families in Boston to always be able to say, my great-great-great-great-great-grandfather was one of the people there. And the thing they were protesting, what was it? Well, we're all told it was a tax. No, it was an exemption from a tax. It was a tax favor. It was a grant of tax relief by the king and the parliament to the friends of the king who had invested in this horribly mismanaged company called the British East India Company, who were going to go bankrupt. Because in those days, if you went bankrupt, what happened to you was what happened, at least briefly, to Justice Wilson of our Supreme Court later in 1798. You went to jail. And jail back then, by the way, was quite different. They often had no locks on the doors. You went to a house, you brought your own chair and bed, and if somebody didn't bring you food, you starved to death. But there was minimal security. But this was a favor for the wealthy investors who weren't very good, who'd mismanaged this company. And that's what motivated us to have our revolution. That was sort of the key act. And by the way, there wasn't one Boston Tea Party. There were like 30 of them. They were in Rhode Island and Connecticut, wherever ships came in. And interestingly, in November of 1773, the month before the Boston Tea Party, 3 out of 4 cups of tea that were drunk in Boston were Dutch tea, because another provision was creating a monopoly for British East India Company tea that would make it a crime to sell Dutch tea, which was widely regarded as being superior. That's why it had 3/4 of the market. It was also cheaper. So we started this country with the idea that we were going to do this radical thing for which we have only 2 known antecedents in history, one of which is not relevant to our Constitution, of self-governance. We're going to trust ourselves. But the people who did it, who were the wealthiest people in the country, who were businessmen of their day, most of them were farmers, but a number of them, like Thomas Jefferson, were also inventors and business people and shopkeepers, some lawyers, John Adams perhaps most famously. They didn't trust the popular will. They were afraid people could be manipulated and that we could end up with a tyrant. So they put in these protections and measures to save us from a tyrant. Well, now what's happened to our country in modern times? Well, up until very recently, we saw year after election after vote that a smaller percentage of the public were turning out to vote. When I was in high school and college, there was a big effort to get the vote for people who were 18. Remember, if you're old enough to get drafted and die in Vietnam, you're old enough to vote. I didn't, because of when my birthday fell, get to vote until I was 23, but that was a big fight back then. And yet the group that's voted the least have been 18 to 24-year-olds. Who votes the most? Us. gray hairs. We're the ones who turn out to vote. Who has the money? Us. And it's made the country appear to be more conservative than all the sociological data says that it is. And we also make it hard to vote. Just as we only allowed people to vote who were freeholders in New Jersey, for example, we have elections on Tuesdays. Why do we have elections on Tuesdays? Well, because working people can't go vote. California, they passed a law. I grew up in California, lived there for 36 of my first 40 years, and they passed a law that your employer had to give you time off to go vote. Yeah, try and do it. Many places, the polls in primaries open at noon and close at 6 p.m. Happened to me the year I was going to go down and vote, because I vote in the Republican primaries, for Huckabee for president. You know why? I mean, how many chances do you get in your lifetime to vote for someone who thinks that cinnamon buns cure diabetes and human beings lived with dinosaurs? Turned out the polls opened at noon, and I had to fly to work at the New York Times at 8:30 in the morning, so I didn't get to vote, instead of 6 a.m. like they do the rest of the year. Well, when people don't participate in our government, the whole democratic system atrophies. And then we had Watergate. You know, when that was going on 46 years ago, I got a little tiny piece of the Watergate story. I was in Lansing, Michigan, but I figured out how to get a little piece of it. And I was like so happy that I was able to do that. Got on the front page of the Detroit Free Press, and my little story that day was the big national story on the TV news that night. But what happened in Watergate was this sudden focus by the public on all this money in politics. Remember John Mitchell, the head of CREEP, and how they had a safe with $250,000 cash, and there were these checks they wrote that Woodward and Bernstein, mostly Bernstein, traced down. And there was all this, the money in politics, how much it is. So good government groups, People for the American Way being perhaps the preeminent one, said, we've got to reform campaign finance. And Michigan, where I was covering, I was the investigative reporter for Outstate, and my boss was the politics reporter, we just covered everything in the world about campaign finance reform in Michigan, and we got in Michigan the toughest campaign finance law in the country. It was an absolute model of what everybody thought you should do at the time. Turned out to be an absolute disaster, just as our federal laws have, because what they've done is they've made politicians even more dependent on people with money. And as we've tried to reduce that dependence, what have we gotten? Dark money. The independent committees that just amazingly, without talking to anybody, coordinate so well. Oh, I'm sorry, they're not allowed to coordinate. They coordinate so well with the candidates' campaigns. These reforms have not worked. Then we have another phenomenon come along, and that was after Watergate. People were so disillusioned about Washington that we got Jimmy Carter, probably the most decent man to ever be president of the United States, somebody who was competent, but who, as his critics would say, thought everything was equally important, as opposed to Ronald Reagan, who cared about three things, and that was it, and then took a nap. Jimmy Carter had not been in Washington. He didn't know how it worked. He was the opposite of Lyndon Johnson, who knew every lever and every way to deal with people to the extent any human being can. Who follows him? Ronald Reagan, an actor who plays a character called Ronald Reagan, because Ronald Reagan was a smart guy. He wasn't this sort of folksy dumb guy you saw, whose principal shortcoming was that he was lazy. He didn't know how Washington worked. And he had all these corrupt people around him, 137 indictments. Yeah. Who's he followed by? He's followed by someone who knows Washington, who is a serious patrician person with a high set of standards, George H.W. Bush, who then walks his way out of the presidency by telling people to watch his lips. He's followed by another guy who knows nothing about Washington, Bill Clinton. He's followed by another guy who knows nothing about almost anything, George W. Bush. And then they're followed by this very eloquent, incredibly smart and decent man who also has almost no time in grade. You know, from the day he gets elected unexpectedly to a state Senate seat in Illinois till he's in the White House is like 6 years, Barack Obama, whose signature program, the Affordable Care Act, is only law because of a serious political strategic general, Nancy Pelosi, who saved it for him and who's probably going to be written about, and our great-grandchildren will read about her as the greatest speaker in the history of the country because of her skills. Certainly, if not the greatest, right at the top. And then we get a man who has not done a single day of public service in his life after that. And he has a rabid following. This is a man whose lawyers right across the river, not the little river here, the big one, in court 2 weeks ago said that yes, lawyers say if he were to shoot someone on Fifth Avenue, no law enforcement agency could investigate. He is immune. Something the 3-judge panel hearing this slapped down, but nonetheless, they felt bold enough to make that statement. I get emails and Twitter direct messages and occasionally phone calls from people who tell me we should make Donald emperor. The whole country's messed up. Donald knows how to do everything. There are people who want a tyrant. There are always people who want a tyrant. Democracy requires work if it's going to work. People have to be engaged as citizens. So how did we get to this state of affairs? Well, one of the things that changed was the institutions that supported working people have been decimated. And the Democrats, the party of the working people, played a major role in this. They allowed weakening and weakening and weakening of unions. They bought the arguments that unions are bad for companies. You know, our competitors are all unionized. Japan has mandatory unions. You know why? It's in their constitution. And who wrote their constitution? Well, the staff of that famous firebrand unionist, General Douglas MacArthur. Because he knew that if Japan had unions, it would democratize the country, it would tend to equalize incomes, and it would help resist the bellicose tendencies of the aristocratic class in Japan. And it's worked brilliantly. And by the way, their unions do it by industry. We do it by company. Much better to do it by industry. Most of the Europeans do it by industry. If you want to see a delightful little rom-com with Julia Stiles and some guy, Luke somebody I've never heard of, called, I think it's called The Danish Prince. College girl in Wisconsin meets a guy who turns out to be the Crown Prince of Denmark. But there's a wonderful scene where they're trying to set labor negotiations, and this young man shows his mettle by getting everybody to the table to agree on what they're going to do, and makes the point that he learned from the farming family in Wisconsin. We're all interdependent. Don't think about exploiting other people and mining other people, because we're all interdependent. You got milk cows, you got to have people to drink your milk and buy your cheese. We're all interdependent. You say that today, people will say, oh, you're a socialist. You're a socialist. In fact, Bill O'Reilly just called me a socialist. And I said, interesting. And I wrote a 4-part Twitter thing about this, and I said, interestingly, my books champion competitive markets, but I understand people like Bill think that competitive markets are a socialist scheme, because they just want to mine the public and make all the money they can with no regard for anybody else. So the decimation of unions is a big deal. In fact, I've done graphics for my work that show density of union membership, which peaked in 1973 at 37% of private production workers, and real wages. And they track like this. Unions become weaker, it goes down. When I was head of the newspaper guild at the Philadelphia Inquirer and Daily News, I was surprised the number of low-level management people who'd sidle up to me in the cafeteria or the parking lot, and they'd go, so how are the union talks going? I'd say, what do you care? You're not in the union. And they'd say, because you guys set our pay. We don't set the pay of executives, but you know, if you're a Chevy plant or a Ford plant, the foreman on the floor, the shop supervisor, even probably the manager of the whole factory, their pay is set by the UAW, plus whatever premium they get. They're not talent. Now, if you're a TV or radio talk show host who brings in money, or a movie star, in many cases, you're talent. You can negotiate your pay, but very few people can do that. A secretary is a secretary, a police officer is a police officer, a newspaper reporter is a newspaper reporter. There are some differences. Hey, we know this cop solves crimes. We want him in our detective squad, but he still gets detective pay. He doesn't get real pay recognizing his contributions. So unions being weakened took away an important element for people to be able to have their interests presented for them and to organize them. Look what's happened to people in the social justice movements. Christians, Jews, and to the extent that they have a little population then, a bigger population now, Muslims in America have all had social justice organizations. When I was with the Los Angeles Times, I remember I flew to give a talk to a big interdenominational group in New York City in the early 80s, and they owned an entire building. It was like 12 stories. And I got off on every floor of the elevator, and it was, the Presbyterians this and the Methodists that, and the, religious community for free Bibles or something over here. But it was just full of, it's gone. It's just gone. Attendance actually at churches, gone. So those organizations that were focused on the message of the New Testament and the idea that you have an obligation to your fellow man and to provide people with a means to interface with government, that's just shriveled away like unions have. And what's risen in their place? Corporate America. Now, corporations are good things. I want to be real clear about that. They encourage people to take risk. They're smart vehicles for building wealth. But they also have to be controlled. And the reason is they are soulless entities. A corporation has no morals, and its purpose is to make money. And it will do whatever's necessary. If we need to induce diabetes in millions of children by getting them to drink sugary soft drinks and eat too many French fries and greasy hamburgers, they'll do that. They will do whatever they need to do to fulfill their purpose. And that's why we need to channel that and control it. Gordon Gekko said, the fictional Gordon Gekko, greed is good. Well, greed isn't good, but it can be useful, but we have to challenge that greed, channel that greed, so that it becomes useful to our society. And what's happened as these other institutions, these religious institutions that appeal to our better angels, that appeal to our sense of self, have atrophied. Who has filled that void? People who will tell you, we are not a society. We are just 330 million people who share the same real estate. That you have no obligation to other people. Everything should be done through contracts. You should negotiate everything by contract. Imagine how tiring that would be if you literally tried to do that. How much time it would take instead of doing things through government services. I've met people who want to repeal the 14th Amendment. I've jousted with people where they've said that, we need to get rid of the minimum wage. And I said, fine, what do you want to do? Return to the ancient world, not the modern antebellum slavery of the Western Hemisphere, but the ancient world concept. You could sell yourself into slavery, because after all, if you did that, you wouldn't starve. Yeah, we should try that. Literally had somebody say that. Rand Paul's father, he wanted to repeal the 14th Amendment. There's a movement to repeal it. It's fringe right now, but I don't know about tomorrow. How about the 13th Amendment? There's a movement to repeal that. There are people who argue the Supreme Court should declare the 13th Amendment unconstitutional. We get the government that we choose because we chose to make this government. Nobody's going to do this for us. We decided we don't want King George telling us what to do. We don't want the modern czar, Vladimir Putin, telling us what to do. We're going to decide for ourselves, but if we don't decide, if we don't vote, if we don't know what we're voting about when we do, we're not going to be able to be a free people. Every time I have someone tell me that we really need to get rid of all these protests, you shouldn't be able to burn a flag. You know, my father-in-law, as far right-wing a guy as there was in America and a very influential figure in his day, argued many Supreme Court cases. My father-in-law, naval officer, rose to captain, said, what did I go fight World War II for if it wasn't to protect people's right to do things I hate, like burn a flag? We go crazy over somebody who says they're going to take a knee at a football game, but not over people who are desecrating our flag in other ways. And one of the things has flowed out of this that's very connected. Those of us with gray hair in this room can remember the 60s as the era when we talked about empowerment, that we had demonstrations. There were college buildings that I was covering these things for the San Jose Mercury when I was literally a teenager. I was a front page staff writer at that newspaper. And students were out changing the world. And now, what will people tell you? I get letters, you can't fight City Hall. The corporations have all the power. We can't do anything about it. And let me give you a really good example of how completely powerless people feel. I run a little news service called DC Report, which I hope all of you bookmark and go to. DC Report's mission is to cover what the current administration and Congress is doing to our government. We have broken lots of stories that became news much later, often with no credit to us. For example, today's New York Times has a story about a Supreme Court case that the excellent Adam Liptak, who covers the Supreme Court, didn't put it this way, but we did, has the potential to completely undo the Clean Water Act's most important provisions and just let companies pollute. Depending on how this case is decided, the requirement for a permit, if you have a drain that goes into the Hackensack River here, or into any other river, you'll be able to get around by simply drilling a hole in the ground and having it drain into the ground, because then it's not a point of pollution going into a navigable waterway. We wrote about that months ago. We wrote about coal slurry ponds. Some of them are 100 years old, and they've been breaking and ruining people's drinking water, not to mention killing wildlife, and all sorts of other stuff, because we just cover the public record. We look at what's in the Federal Register. We don't expect people to read the Federal Register. We do think journalists should read the Federal Register. And we've been focusing on these issues for people to inform them. Well, the response we get from a lot of people is, who cares about government? Your liberties entirely depend on our government. They 100% depend on it. Look what's happening in Russia with the modern czar. The most minor people involved in challenging the government are being rounded up and disappeared. It's Argentina, except they're not throwing, as best we know, people out of airplanes into the South Atlantic. But people are just being disappeared. By the way, in America, we have thousands, we now know, of children who parents came to the southern border, or sometimes they came to the southern border on their own, seeking asylum, which they are legally entitled to apply for, like our law or not, that's the law, who've just disappeared. There are no records of what happened to them. What do you think the odds are that some of them have ended up in the possession of pedophiles? I'd say they're about equal to the likelihood the sun is going to rise in the east tomorrow. Of course, that's what's happened to some of them. We get the government that we work for. Now, it's very hard for us to do that these days because we've changed our society. Up until the 60s, most women who had small children stayed at home. This is not an argument that women should be barefoot and pregnant. My wife's a CEO, okay? But what about all the women who work out of economic necessity because of falling wages? That's the group we should be concerned about. And to think that we don't pay some kind of a price for not having at least one stay-at-home parent is foolish. Of course they pay a price for that. There's a concept I like to use in my reporting I call the UL, the Universal Ledger. All costs are accounted for in the Universal Ledger. The financial statements of a company only account for those costs they have to pay attention to. So pollution that goes up the smokestack or down the drain pipe, mistreatment of workers who become sick or disabled and have to end their careers early, those don't show up on the books of the company. Shorting the pension plan so it later collapses and the taxpayers have to pick it up, those don't show up on the books of the company, but they all show up on the Universal Ledger. Every cost is accounted for on the Universal Ledger. The Europeans have decided that the next generation, the evergreen next generation, is so important that they require you in a number of countries to not work. In Norway, where a bunch of my ancestors come from north of the Arctic Circle, you are not allowed to work if you have a small child. And by the way, both mom and dad have to take time off. You take it together, you can take it separately, but you both have to take time off. That's how important they think it is. Now, how many of you have been to Norway? You notice the extent of all the poverty caused by this program? The houses are falling apart, the roads, right. It's ridiculous. It works perfectly well. They do have some billionaires, but they don't have nearly as many as we do. And proportion to their population, they don't have as many, but they have a healthy, happy society. People don't have time to go do things like turn out tonight. Why is this audience not full of people in their 20s and 30s and 40s? Because they're working like dogs to put together a living. They're trying to buy houses when we've created a housing market that, you know, the New York Times runs these little, I call them real estate porn things on Sunday. What $2 million will buy you, you know, $2 million for a house? Oh, wow. Well, tyrants breed in this environment. Now, I'm not worried about Donald Trump seizing power. He does not have the support of our military officer corps. We learned that very early in his administration from some incidents that happened, but more importantly, a poll by Military Times. And in the military, let me use the Army as my model here, so I have to get deep into ranks. Lieutenants through majors are tactics. Colonels and generals do strategy. The strategy people have no use for Donald Trump. I have met many, many general officers of the US military. Every single one of them I walked away and said to myself, that person is competent and I see why they were promoted. They may have been jerks of the first water, because some of them were absolute horrible human beings, but I respected that they were competent. That is, our system for identifying and promoting military officers for leadership actually works. In my biography of Donald Trump, I cite the Army Field Manual 6, which is the selection of officers for promotion because they have leadership skills. And someone who knows this better than I do had reduced this to 6 basic lessons. Do you take responsibility for what you do? Do you credit other people? Are you open to recognizing a mistake and correcting it, etc.? And Donald Trump flunks every one of those measures, every single one of them. But because he doesn't have real leadership skills, he's who he is. He's a con man and a con artist. He's not a businessman. He's a cash extractor who gets a hold of a business, takes cash out of it, and puts it aside. He's not capable of being a tyrant and taking over the country. That's not going to happen. But we need to worry about what happens when someone comes along who has a really deep philosophy. Adolf Hitler had a really deep philosophy, and it didn't come out of nowhere. It came out of 100 years of German and Polish and Austrian and Russian and Belarus and Ukrainian literature and philosophy about the demon Jews and the Romas and the cripples and the other, that's their word, not mine. And he was deeply steeped in this stuff. What about competent managers? Another thing I can see, Vladimir Putin appears to be a reasonably competent manager. He's the leader of the biggest international gang in the world. These are the criminals who stole the wealth of the old Soviet, which in theory, right, belonged to the people. But the people didn't get shares of stock. This small group of people did. And he's just the leader of the gang. And the way criminal gang leaders work, and I've written about lots of criminal gangs over my career, I don't want to spend my time dealing with your squabble with you. You know, this is your territory, that's your territory, don't bother me. If there's a problem, I'll intervene. If necessary, I'll have one of you whacked. Because I want to do what I want to do. By the way, that's how the pharaohs operated in Egypt. They want to deal with people's petty problems. So they set up, I kid you not, the equivalent of a modern wage and hour court in 1350, before the current era. We have records of a trial from a guy who got cheated on his wages. You delegate out, you set certain boundaries. That's how tyrants operate. Well, there are people in this country looking at what's going on right now, and either for themselves or someone they think they can put in that position. Because remember, every politician has people around them who are going to promote them. There's a great scene in the movie by Aaron Sorkin, The American President, where the president is Michael Douglas and the advisor is Martin Sheen, and they're playing pool. And he lectures him that he wouldn't be in the White House. He'd be the most popular history professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, but for the Martin Sheen character pushing him to go where he needs to go. There are people out there looking at what we're doing in this country and realizing Americans have become so disaffected from their government, so disconnected from it, so amenable to messages like all taxes are bad. Tax is the most vile three-letter word in America. Trying to get people to understand, as I'm going to try and do in my next book, that we can have a wholly different tax system that will actually make us wealthier. I hope the publisher agrees to call it the prosperity tax. It's going to be a very tough sell because so many people have been brainwashed on this idea that tax, bad. Try to tell them we created this country so we could tax ourselves. What? Nobody ever told me that. Well, those kinds of people we need to worry about. Think about someone who's like Donald Trump in that he has this charisma, and you got to hand it to Donald. He's a great con man. He has these audiences wrapped around his finger. People who believe literally, you know, he looks up to the sky and implies that he's God. Did you see any pastors or rabbis or imams saying that's sacrilegious? I didn't. I looked. There may have been somewhere, but it certainly didn't make the news anywhere. He just now has someone on his staff in the White House who basically says the Democrats are demonic. Yeah. And it's really quite shocking to see what this person who's what I call a faux Christian, she's a God wants me to be rich, so send me money and God will love you sort of person. These kinds of folks, they're looking to advance their interests because they aren't thinking about the society around them. They're not thinking about anything in the New Testament about your obligation to your fellow citizen. They think, I'm in this for me, and how do I get the system to work for me? And that's how tyrants work. So imagine somebody who has Donald's charisma, but first-rate management skills, actually knows how to be an executive and get things done, how to prioritize, how to follow up, how to select people and hold them accountable. And who doesn't believe you should be able to question what he does? That's what I'm worried about, is the tyrant next time, is the competent person, the scary person who is going to seize power in the same way the ancient Greeks talked of tyrants as someone who seized power. And I don't want a benevolent tyrant. I want the liberties of the people to endure. That is a phrase I use all the time. Because if we don't recognize that with modern advertising and marketing techniques, with a campaign finance system with hidden money in it, with foreign influence, even without the invitations made by Donald Trump, who, I've known Donald for 31 years. He doesn't see anything wrong with asking Putin to interfere. He really doesn't, because he has no conscience. Yeah. His whole family, they have no conscience. They believe what they're doing is good for the country. They've convinced themselves of that. And they've gotten millions and millions of people to agree with them. What we need to worry about is people who will understand how to do that. Think about how successful this country has been in getting young people to eat this horrible diet for which there will be a huge price to pay down the road in terms of health status and shorter lives. Think about how successful the advertising industry has become in getting people to buy things they don't need. I mean, when I was young, we were told if you put Brill cream in your hair, the girls would be all over you. I mean, right, we all laugh, that's crazy. You know what? The people who made Brill cream made a lot of money. Most people respond to suggestions. Now, one of the ways to overcome this is that we need to recognize that our education system has not really been redesigned since it was begun in the 19th century. Public education in this country, which a lot of people are against. I have no trouble in Rochester, New York, a reasonably enlightened city that had a great history for 100 years as the industrial era equivalent of Silicon Valley, Seattle, and Route 128 in one place. I have no trouble finding people who say we should just get rid of public education. Well, what if your kids can't afford to go to school? Well, you know, that's their problem. Maybe they shouldn't have kids. You can find people, if you look around right here in northern Jersey, who hold the same sort of views about these things. Our education system back then was designed to teach the skills needed by industry. Remember, we went from being an agrarian society. 90% of people in the original 1790 census were tied to the farm. In 1900, it was 43%. It was still almost half the country tied directly to the farm. In 1950 and 1960, I lived on a farm. It was an orange ranch in Orange, California, but we were farmers. Anybody here know someone who actually lives and works on a farm today? It's 1% of the population. It's 1% of the population that are real farmers today, because we've become so efficient at it. But with this change, we didn't change our education system. We needed people who could work in factories, who could read elemental rules. When Mercedes-Benz got this huge subsidy from Alabama to build a car plant in Alabama, the one that, by the way, if you buy the cars that come from there, they're the ones that get written up for all the manufacturing defects. They learned that they had to give people color-coded cards to tell them how to do the work because they were so illiterate. When Toyota decided to build its assembly factory in Hamilton, Ontario, they said that there were two factors. One was the cost of healthcare wouldn't be on their books, because in Canada it's a social cost, not the individual company cost. But they also said in Hamilton people could read instructions and guidebooks and they didn't have to spend nearly as much money training them and correcting their mistakes. Our education system was designed to produce drones. People who don't question authority, people who do what they're told, and people who don't have critical thinking skills, who are not trained to think. I've had better conversations about economy, culture, politics, diplomacy, military strategy with a waiter in a little restaurant off on the side in the woods in Austria, a random person who sat down on the couch next to me in Singapore, a police officer in rural Ontario, than I've had with educated business people sitting next to me in the first class section of a plane. I fly so much they give me first class all the time. I mean, some of these people, their knowledge of our government is just appalling, even though they're sitting there in $4,000 Brioni suits. So we have to fix our education system. We have to stop protecting football by getting rid of arts and literature. We have to stop. Years ago, there was a young man I helped who was graduated from high school but was essentially illiterate, and who's now successful in both business, and he has a job as a machinist, so he has a steady income. And he couldn't read. He really couldn't read. And I eventually got him to be able to read, and then he went on to do well and have a family. And it turned out when he took English that his teacher didn't give you books. In fact, when you came in the room, there's another teacher in Rochester schools has a cabinet that has glass, you know, so you can see the books. And he says to the students on the first day, these are not for you. And then he shows them movies. Well, I'm sorry, my Great Gatsby isn't your Great Gatsby, right? The whole point of a novel is that you have to think these things through in your head and identify with what sociologists call, with capital letters, the other. We're not doing that. In New York State, what we are doing is requiring poor kids in inner city schools to read Shakespeare. I mean, I know what every really poor kid needs is to understand the Bard, instead of Walter Mosley, who writes about people who live in the inner city and are noble people that would mean something to them. About 15% of Americans get a fabulous public education, and we're seeing the results of that in the digital age, and the people who create these wonderful products like, you can know that you got a phone call on your phone and how fast your heart's beating when you're working out, and watch a movie and move money and buy a plane ticket. But the other 85% are not. And they are very vulnerable to manipulation, advertising, because we tell them government's not for you. You don't know anything. We also, I believe, need to expand our Congress. The original Bill of Rights had 12 amendments. We only adopted 10. One of them would have set the size of Congress as one member for every 50,000 people, which means today we'd have our 66,000 members of Congress. I don't think we need that many, but here's a question. How many of you have a phone on which you have numbers, you can just press a button or the person's name and it rings? Almost everybody, right? How many of you have your congressperson on that phone? Well, good for you. How many of you, if you ring it, know that your congressperson will pick it up and talk to you? Staff, not the congressperson. And I got this idea because right after we moved to Rochester, New York in 1993, we had some very prominent top business people sitting in our backyard on a warm night, drinking my cheap scotch as opposed to when I go to their homes, they're very good scotch. And I made this remark about, getting your congressperson on the phone, and most people can't do it, whereupon one of the people had a flip phone, remember those? Open it up, push, bing, bing. Hi, Louise, how are you? Got our congressperson on the phone. We need to have a bigger Congress. We need to have a bigger Supreme Court. Not 11 members, but 13 or 15, because they're not taking all the cases we need to take. And we need to recognize that we are the ones who are choosing what is happening here. If we lose our liberties, it isn't just that down that road lie firing squads and they will be down that road. It is that we chose it by not acting. And hard as it is, and tired as we are, and much as our grandchildren or grown children will say, I'm busy, just like we were raising kids, we need to create an environment that says you have power, you have responsibility, you must act. So hopefully, this is my third talk to your group. Hopefully I will be called back in 2021 when my tax book is out, which will be a very short read because you can't tell people I'm going to simplify the tax code and have them believe you if you write a doorstop. And everybody who's been over my tax system, who's a tax administrator or an accountant or a tax lawyer or a business, well, I've only had one business person, they all agree that what I've done works. They just don't believe it'll be adopted. When I do that, I'm going to make sure the flyer says, bring a young person. Find somebody, kid in the neighborhood who mows your lawn or plows, shovels the walk, grandchild, a student, you somehow drag in, but young people so that they think about these things. But what we need to worry about is not so much what's going on right now. The dam has been breached. The facts are coming out. We will make a choice about what we're going to do here. We're actually going to get 2 bites at that apple through impeachment and through the election. What we need to be thinking about is after this is over, we need to worry about making sure we don't have to deal with the tyrant next time. So, thank you. Can you grab my water bottle? So I'm going to take some questions from people, and I know some people want to shoot pictures, and we're happy to do that after we're done. But questions? Thank you, Rhoda. Hi there.
Hi. I remember the whole Vietnam thing, and when they passed the 18-year-old vote, and that had to happen because of the draft. And when they
Yes, the draft was a big influence. If we'd had a draft in 2003, we would not have invaded Iraq.
Exactly, and I sort of want to bring back the draft or some kind of required national service, because boy, did that get people engaged.
Well, let me, I spoke before he died to the guy who came up with the idea of the all-volunteer army, who was an economics professor at the University of Rochester. I went to, for a couple of semesters, to the University of Chicago, which is the Chicago school. Rochester is known as the University of Chicago's University of Chicago. And his whole argument was that the government should have no ability to draft you. Even in he pretty much seemed to indicate that even in World War II, it was wrong to draft people. This is a wrongful exercise of the police power of the state. So, let's submit to the Nazis rather than make you give up some of your liberty. And he argued it was good because all these poor kids could go to college. And I would say, well, maybe we should go back to when I went to college and it was free. And then, by the way, if you didn't perform, what did they do? They threw you out. Now, oh no, we'll keep you because they want the tuition money for many of these kids. So I think that the idea of a draft and national service is a real control on the people who want to get us into wars. And if you follow Tom Cotton, the Republican senator from Arkansas, we just had this family wiped out. These are Mormons. Mitt Romney's family historically is part of this group of renegade Mormons. Should disclose I'm a tried and convicted heretic. And there actually are heretics in the 21st century. They were apparently killed because of incompetence by drug gangs that are having a war, who thought this SUV they were in or vehicles they were in were the other gang. And what does Tom Cotton want to do? What he always wants to do. The solution to this problem is guns. He wants us to go get the army and go after these people. That's a terrible solution to things. When you need to do it, you do it, but not when you don't need to do it. So yeah, I think I am very much in favor of a draft. Had I been drafted, I would have gone. I, to be honest, knew that I was unlikely to be drafted because technically I'm a war orphan and I had children and they weren't drafting fathers. But, my draft board had said, you're going, I wouldn't have fought them. I would have said, okay. So who else? About right behind you, one row back and then 2 rows after behind that.
I had a question.
Yeah.
I was very pleased when you opened up by discussing about how competent and wonderful Nancy Pelosi is, because I'm a huge fan. And so during this whole, maybe the last year or so, I'm on social media a lot, Facebook and Twitter, and she's either in those platforms either held up as the queen or the demon.
It's a real black and white world.
Yeah, but I mean, you get the same people though saying these. When she's doing well, when things are going our way, she's wonderful, and when she's not doing what they think she should be doing, she's horrible.
So what's the question?
My question is, what do you think about that? Because
Well,
I will not say a bad word about Nancy Pelosi. I have to assume she's smart enough that she's got a strategy, and that's what I tell people in social media. She's smart enough, believe her.
Nancy, as I said, I think is a 5-star general of political strategy. She's not perfect. But the reason you see people do these things is they don't have any deep grounding in any sort of philosophy or history. I mean, all the things I told you about ancient Greece and the Constitution, I didn't learn those till I was a reporter and I wanted to understand why, the police do this and the tax system does that. And so I went and started studying the antecedents of these things. We don't need to teach at that level, but we certainly need to teach much better than we're doing. And since you brought up Nancy, I'll tell you my little story. Nancy invited me to speak to the Democratic caucus, and I said I would come provided that they encouraged the Republicans to have me come talk about taxes and making things better, getting for small business, and pointing out I was registered as a Republican. And they showed me emails making it clear they'd told them, and they'd said, pfft. So I came down, and Nancy gets up to introduce me, and of course, Nancy is, I think a lot of 18-year-olds wish they had Nancy's figure. And Nancy gets up in her $4,000 dress with her Christian Louboutins and introduces me, and I referred during my talk to the members of Congress as you guys. And she came up to me later, she says, I think that was a little disrespectful, calling you guys. And I said, it was intentional. You guys need to come down a notch. You work for us. And I said, by the way, since you brought that up, Nancy, I have no aversion to wealth. I'm a model example of going up the income and wealth ladder. But the leader of the Working People's Party is standing in front of me in, $4,000 dress and Louboutins. How about some dungarees? Well, the only time I've ever spoken at a demonstration in my life was April of 17 in the city I was born in, San Francisco, about Trump's tax returns. And Nancy shows up and she walks up to me and she goes, "Dungarees." And I looked at her and I said, "Yeah, $4,000 designer dungarees." All right, the lady in purple.
I don't know if you feel comfortable talking about this, but given the demonization of socialism in the media right now, who do you feel is the most competent candidate we have to defeat Donald Trump?
Okay. Well, competent to defeat him or competent to be president? Those are different questions. So, all right, well, some people are going to be very unhappy with this. Bernie Sanders is potentially a winner, but he's not competent to be president. He has no management skill. He's passed 3 bills in his whole history in Congress, 2 of which were naming buildings. And he's disliked by many members of the Democratic caucus. He's not a Democrat, by the way, but because he would make deals and break his word. And those are real serious problems beyond the fact that he's 78. And I do think I'm 70, so I don't think I'm being an ageist here, that I'm worried about 78. Joe Biden is clearly electable. He was quite courageous. I don't know how many of you know that he went to, during the war in Bosnia schizophrenia, he went to the bad guys, and I, at this point, don't remember who were the good guys, who were the bad guys, but he sat down across the table from Milosevic and his gang and basically said, we're going to arrest you and execute you if necessary if you don't knock off this Nazi murdering policy. Well, that's pretty incredible, and almost nobody seems to know about it, just like people don't know that Hillary Clinton travels with a Bible in her purse and prays with her staff every day. So he's totally electable. He'd be an okay president. Elizabeth Warren, whom I know, I know Bernie a little bit, I know Elizabeth a little bit. She is the most dedicated public servant I've ever met in my life, but she's also demonstrating that she has a staff that's not serving her well. The idea that she's going to take office and then we're going to immediately go to Medicare for all, that's just crazy. I mean, you can't change a system that is 18% of the economy overnight. You've got to go there in stages. And she just can't bring herself to say, the goal is universal health care, and I'm going to set down a program that's going to get us there as quickly as we can move people to it. Because health insurance is a superfluous industry that there's no reason for it to exist. And my authority on that is Donald Trump, who said to me back in 1988 or 89, I said, because he's a big employer, right? What do you think about health care and health insurance, Donald? And he said, health care should be like the roads. When you need it, you just use it. And I said, and out of pocket? He says, I don't pay when I drive the roads, do you? So Kamala Harris is proven to be a competent administrator as Attorney General. She's got some baggage that people who want to do justice reform are going to like, but show me a prosecutor. There are a few, but not many, who are in the forefront of being public defenders while they're prosecutors. Pete Buttigieg doesn't have any time and grade. I mean, he is Barack Obama and Jimmy Carter on steroids. He's the mayor of a little town in Indiana. Get elected governor and run the state of Indiana for 4 or 8 years. Get elected to the Senate, and when you're 60 years old, and I probably won't be here to see it, run for president. By the way, the other person I think might be president someday is David Hogg, one of the survivors in Florida, who that young man I have yet to see make a single mistake or take the bait from anybody. Julian Castro is not going to, none of the other people are going to get it. It's going to be one of those top 3 in all likelihood, unless somebody comes out of nowhere Bloomberg announced he's looking at that today. Bloomberg was, detested as a mayor by the end of his administration. He was very focused on Manhattan and not the outer boroughs. And on the other hand, guy's a brilliant businessman whose annual income's in the neighborhood of $4 billion a year. But I find that hard to think that he's going to get anywhere. If things fall apart, another possibility, somebody wouldn't run as Sherrod Brown. And you got to wonder, why did he not do it? Why did Colin Powell not do it? And the likely answer in all of those is there's something they don't want to have come out in their background. You know, and we got to get over this, you know. Gee, high school kids smoke dope. Well, you can't be president of the United States. I'm sorry, we have a first lady who did porn and lied to work in this country and brought her parents through, what do they call it, chain migration, Donald calls it. So, but the Democrats, you know, have a problem that they don't have a lot of bench strength they've built up over the years. And we really do need to have as president somebody who understands Washington, not outsiders. You know, we need to have people who know the levers. I mean, you know, where's Lyndon Johnson when we need him? So down here in the front. No men. Have I intimidated all the men in the room? We'll go to you next.
Just one candidate you didn't mention that I personally like is Klobuchar.
Okay, so it's Amy Klobuchar, who was the Hennepin County DA, was pretty badly hurt by that New York Times piece about how she treats her staff. By the way, Bernie does the same thing. He's known as a terrible boss. I think we need to report things like that. I was surprised at the depth of the reaction to it. She's obviously a very decent person and has appears to have the management competence. I'm concerned almost anybody should be able to beat Donald. The question is somebody who's competent. I mean, I voted in the primary in 2016 for John Kasich. I can't stomach what he wants to do with women's bodies, but I trust his finger on the button, and I trust that he's a competent manager. And Congress's job would be to control somebody like that. But, all right, the student, I think, and then another student behind, our first guy.
Good evening. Good evening.
Hi.
So you mentioned briefly before about the really serious problem about getting the younger generation to vote. So last year, a bunch of corporations and like companies like Google, they collaborated in an effort to advertise more voting. And
voting went up among young people in this last election.
So would you say that this was a step in the positive direction of getting the younger generation to step up, or was this a negative sign about how technology can really control our lives?
Boy, somebody who can think in complicated issues. Thank you. Yeah, both of those. You know, I think we have way too much corporate influence, and Google is a sort of poster child for that. Too much concentration. I mean, one of the problems with capitalism is competitive markets over time. The less well-financed and less well-managed enterprises fall aside and business gets concentrated. And Google is sort of the model of that. I mean, does anybody here ever use Bing to do an internet search? I do it every now and then just so I can say I've done Bing, but not really. And so, yes, it's a problem in both ways. And part of that is, hey, why don't we require you to register to vote to get your high school diploma? We require you to pass a test on English. You know, let's make it a requirement. Let's sign you up to automatically vote. Let's have voting by mail like they do in Washington and Oregon. And by God, let's please save taxpayers money and ensure integrity by voting on paper ballots. Right behind you.
What do you think about the candidate Andrew Yang for president?
Well, Andrew Yang is the businessman candidate. He's not going to get nominated no matter what happens, okay? So he's a curiosity, but he's raised a lot of good issues, and I think that we need to have some serious discussion. One of the things I worry about the Democrats is they seem to have a deep antagonism to business that they don't need to have. There's no reason to be either antagonistic or worshipful. Let's be a little more nuanced about it. On the side of the Republicans, I have a very wealthy friend I have lunch with once a month at the club, and I said, you know, back in the late 60s, there were academic papers being written in conferences held saying that by 2020, if the Republicans don't change, the demographics are going to kill the Republicans because the country's changing and they need to change. And he looked at me and he said, they can't. It's who they are. The racism is never going away. And that's not good for the country either. I mean, I don't want to have one party ruled by any party. I want to have vibrant competition. So I think Andrew Yang's raised some good questions, and I think the Democrats really need to do some thinking so that They don't have this way that comes across to many business people, I think reasonably, as anti-business. In many cases, not being anti-business, but the way they frame their words is unsettling. So, over here. And then we'll come over here and you.
Hi. What are your thoughts on establishing term limits?
Oh, it's a terrible idea.
Okay, why?
I think it's a terrible idea. Because if someone's competent and people want to return to office, then we should keep them in office. We have term limits in California, and all that happens is people move. You know, senator then runs for assembly, and then you run for county supervisor, and then you go back and run for the Senate. It's a career path to be a politician. We should honor people who go into public service. That was one of John F. Kennedy's big issues. We want the best and the brightest, you know, to go into public service, just not Averill Harriman. And his name is escaping me, but may he burn in hell, McNamara.
I'd like to ask you a question in regard to lobbyists. I look at about 6 different industries in the world, in the country, between the banks, the insurance companies, the drug companies, oil companies, technology, and the lovely oil companies. It bothers me, most of them control what's going on in this country. And with the lobbyists today, well, what do you do?
Okay, so the first thing you have to understand is lobbying is a constitutionally protected activity. It's in the First Amendment. The people shall have the right to assemble peaceably to petition the government for a redress of grievances. By the way, there's no following clause that would say, and the government will respond. They can take your petition and round file it. So recognizing that, I think the answer is we have to change the rules. And one of them is every member of Congress should be required to disclose every meeting they have with everybody and what the substance of it was about or whatever issues were discussed. They don't have to get into the conversation, but today I met with Bill Jones from Big Pharma, and we talked about research financing for biosimilars. That's one. Two, I think that we need to expand the franking privilege. Members of Congress can send all the mail they want, right, for no cost by just signing their name or having a machine sign their name. I think we should give members of Congress a basically unlimited expense account. But they can't spend a quarter without a clerk taking down what they did, because they're right alongside them, reporting it. We'll know, pretty soon which member of Congress on the Health Committee says, well, I really had to charter a jet to go inspect behind the bar at the Tahiti resort. And voters in that district may send the person back, but okay, that's a lot cheaper than what happens now. Congressmen are rented out for really cheap prices for things. So I think we need to reduce that, and I think we need to go to some kind of public finance. And my notion of public finance is you get a budget to run. Once your party nominates you, you get a budget. And you have to live in that budget because it'll tell us how much you're going to respect our tax dollars. Now, the budget in rural Iowa is not going to be the same as the budget in North Jersey. That's a problem we have to address, but we could do it per capita with an adjustment for market costs, because we do that with federal employees, how we pay them. If you're posted duty San Francisco, you get more money than if you're posted duties Keokuk, Iowa. And, but we really need to address that we want public servants to be public servants and get money out of this. And we need to also address this problem of family businesses. On the one hand, if any one of my 8 grown children goes and does something I didn't like at the New York Times position was they had some influence over that. And I was a vociferous critic of that. If you're not dependent on me and you're out of the household, it's none of the Times' business if one of my kids goes to work for a politician, for example. That was a never resolved issue at the Times or anywhere else that I know of. But we do see all sorts of politicians, whose wives or husbands or children are on the take. And I think there's a real problem there. And one solution to that would be to say, if you've served in Congress for 10 years or been the chairman of a standing committee, we're going to pay you your inflation-adjusted salary for life, and you can only work for jobs that you don't have anything to do with lobbying in Washington. That's contrary. I recognize it's not entirely consistent with term limits. But we want to have expertise. I don't know about how many of you saw, by the way, that I wrote a piece at DC Report that we ran yesterday on the first transcripts that came out. And one of the fascinating things they showed was Congressman Jim Jordan, I never heard a wrestler complaining about sexual abuse. He says to a witness, so you had a conversation about these matters involving what the president said and these diplomatic matters with someone who is not even in the government. It's a professor at Georgetown, a former government official. Yes. You mean this actually goes on? Yeah. Experts talk to experts. Wow, what a thought. Oh, he's not an expert. But somehow we need to reduce the influence of big money. We absolutely need to get rid of dark money. If you go back and read Zephyr Teachout's book on corruption, her point is that the framers of the Constitution did not think of corruption in terms of individual venality. They thought of it in institutional and structural terms. They recognized individual members of Congress or presidents would do dishonest acts because people are people, right? But they didn't want the institutions corrupted, and we need to get back to that concept. Instead of having a Supreme Court that is essentially legalized bribery, they've given you a roadmap. Here's how you bribe politicians and do it legally. And that's horrible, so.
Yes, during the Great Recession, a number of companies were bailed out, and the CEOs still did very well after that. Would it not be better to let the market discipline these companies that are inefficient and fail, rather than having them bailed out by the government at taxpayer expense?
That's a really good question. As a general rule, we want companies that fail in the market to fail. In the case of the auto industry, however, if we lost the auto industry, think about what things would be like now in Indiana and Ohio when they needed a reset. And we got paid back. I mean, General Motors paid us back sooner than they were supposed to. Ford did not seek any kind of a bailout. Chrysler is really a foreign corporation now. So the question would be, would we bail out the Chobol in, I'm sure I mispronounced that, the Korean enterprise that owns the combined company that controls Hyundai and Kia, which now sell like every ninth new car in the US. Well, now we go to the other side of this, and that is the finance companies. President Obama, who taught constitutional law and is Lawrence Tribe said he was the best student he ever had. I think he also said that of Adam Schiff. President Obama went on 60 Minutes and told Scott Kraft soon after he took office that what went on in Wall Street, he says, it's really terrible, but it's not a crime. And I immediately wrote a piece saying, excuse me, fraud is everywhere and always a crime. All of what happened to us in the housing market was crimes. There were people who produced the document showing that at Countrywide, which did 20% of the mortgage originations in the country, they were fabricating documents. They were holding documents up to windows with the sunlight to trace signatures. They were committing crimes. And Bill Black, who was this nobody ever heard of him regulator, who got the Keating Five indicted and is responsible for more than 3,000 people in the S&L scandals being indicted, and more than 800 senior executives of S&Ls going to prison. Where is Bill? Well, today he's a professor at the University of Missouri, Kansas City Law School, a really minor little place because he's been completely shut out by everybody. He did the right thing. And we should have seen thousands of bankers go to prison, and we should have broken up the big banks. The heads of the too big to fail banks should, they should have been indicted. Yeah. I will tell you, though, they've gotten very smart about this. Jamie Dimon, for example, does not use email. Really smart crooks have all learned, and I think he's committed acts that certainly qualify as being a crook. They don't use email, so there's no record. And they deal through subordinates. They'll have one or two people, so they can always say, oh, no, the person misunderstood. I didn't say break the law, even though, the message was clear. And it really is atrocious. It is the worst thing that the Obama administration did. And here's the really bad part, and I'm the person who reported this, and I don't think anybody else did. I did pieces in Newsweek about this. Eric Holder went around saying in speeches, again and again, we have all these big cases, billions of dollars, hundreds of people under investigation. I found out that the Inspector General's office for the Attorney General, the Justice Department, went to him and said that's not true. And at the end of the day, by the way, they had one guy on Wall Street basically and a bunch of nobodies in like Tampa, Florida, you know, 2-bit con artists. And Eric Holder, for 10 months after being told what you're saying isn't true, continued to do it. And I think that's a serious stain on his record. If he's toyed about running for president or being attorney general, I think that should be front and center, that he knowingly lied for all those months. They made a political decision to let the bankers go. They decided the economy would be better off. And all I'd say is, who puts an embezzler in charge of a bank just because the bank's proceeds are growing? That's crazy. People commit crimes like this that the whole economy sinks. We need to take their liberty away. So.
Hi. My question is in regards to, you talked a lot about liberties and the Constitution. I'm a little confused as to what the Republicans mean when they talk about your guns. When they talk about guns, in regards to like gun control, and how they don't want it's in the Constitution, they don't want your liberties taken away from them. But with like all the shootings that have happened, why is it so difficult for them to separate?
That's a really good question that goes right to the core of one of our biggest problems. First of all, until Antonin Scalia and the NRA, which was a membership organization for gun users and is now a lobby for gun manufacturers, the idea that you had an individual unfettered right to a gun was never the law in this country. The Supreme Court adopted the position that, no, you have an unfettered right to have a gun under the Second Amendment. None of the legal scholarship supports that. But as to the reason that you're seeing this issue arise the way it does, this is a really bad thing that's happened with the Republicans. The Republican Party has been taken over. The Wall Street, Main Street coalition of business people and people who were seriously concerned about our geopolitical issues, people like George Herbert Walker Bush, have been replaced by people like Jim Jordan and Mark Meadows and the intellectual equivalents of Bill O'Reilly and Mark Levine. And the Republicans have lost their way. They have just totally lost their way, and it's I believe the campaign finance system and gerrymandering are at the core of this. Think about how much money we spend just because there are so many guns out there on security. The budget of the Secret Service is unbelievably huge. It's in the billions and billions of dollars to protect the president, his family, Supreme Court justices, the Speaker of the House, the Majority Leader. Just incredibly huge because we have all these guns. When I was a young man and would go cover a trial, you just walk into the courthouse. Now you got to go through a metal detector, and we do it at high schools. What message are we sending to young people? You got to go through a metal detector to go to class. We really need to rethink these laws. When I owned guns when I was a teenager, I knew that they had to be in the trunk of the car, unloaded, and the bullets either had to be in a locked case in the car, in the trunk, or in the glove compartment, and it had to be locked. That is, they had to be separated. And we've changed all of that. And police officers now, one of the things they're complaining about is they go to somebody's reported a crime, and they arrive, and here's a guy standing there who's got an AK-47 across his chest and a pistol. Are you the good guy or the bad guy? They don't know. And some of the most awful shootings we've seen have grown out of things like that, where the cops are flipped out about this. And by the way, we have lots of research that if you're Hispanic or black, you're much more likely to be shot. I've taken police combat training and watched other people after I did it, and it was astonishing to me to see LA sheriff's deputies respond differently when the pop-ups would come based on the characteristics of the people's faces. They're just like, whoa! But the research is quite clear about that sort of thing. And so, you know, none of these people who argue that the Second Amendment protects you from the government have a whit of sense about them. I mean, does anybody actually think that this incredible trained military that we have, with all of its skills, where it can go in and kill Osama bin Laden without losing anybody, can take down somebody like al-Baghdadi, and at the same time, rescue little children they want out of that situation, that a bunch of amateurs with their playing, who play soldier are going to protect us if the government just turns on us? I mean, this is just laughable. They don't have howitzers. They don't have tanks. They don't have armored personnel carriers. They don't have bombs. But it's just a fantasy, and we really need to address it. It's a real problem. So, one more. Then I'm gonna make a little wrap mark, and if you want to shoot pictures or something, or you brought a book, come on up. There's no rush to get out of here on my part.
You've worked for some really terrific newspapers and done some really terrific work on those newspapers. How do you feel about the hollowing out of the newspapers in this country? 60% of our counties don't even have a daily newspaper. Yeah. And a lot of people depend totally on perhaps Sinclair Media, who sends, which sends out talking points, which are mandatory for all of their stations.
Well, and which took a naval officer who invented a military tactic that saved what I'm sure were hundreds of American sailors' lives, and swift-boated him by lying about him. I mean, a man who created a new military tactic that turned out to be really smart, and very few people know that because of the people at Sinclair. They're pretty awful people.
Yeah. And then you have people that are depending on social media.
Yeah.
And it's kind of self-selecting. If you happen to be on the right wing, you tend to go to red state. If you're on the left wing, you may be going to blue state, etc.
So let me break this into a couple of, is there a specific question?
Yes, and you're talking about the importance of people participating in democracy. So exactly how are we going to get people to do that when largely it takes an awful lot of work to find out the facts and be able to act upon them?
So let me break this into different pieces because there are different issues here. First of all, young man, if you want a career as a criminal, go into government, because kleptocrats are going to do real well in the future. The mere presence of reporters it doesn't stop all the thievery in government, but it has a very constraining effect. Years ago, George Anastasia, the Dartmouth-educated mob reporter at the Philadelphia Inquirer, and I went to see a New Jersey state senator, a very prominent one, in his beautiful, big, painted lady law office in South Jersey. And when we got all done talking about what we'd gone to see, he turns to me and he says, "Nate, you know why I've never taken a dime or a dollar?" "No." And he said, "Well, sit down." He said, "George and I have known each other since, some equivalent of we couldn't grow a beard." And, George Anastasia. George Anastasia, the reporter, they'd known each other since they were very young. And he said, "Every time I've been tempted," and he said, "if you're a chairman of a committee and you're a senator in this state, let me tell you, you get temptation put in front of you every day. I would think about George, because I knew that George would find out. George would write it up in a way that I would get indicted, and he would be standing there with his notebook as I was let off in handcuffs, having lost my wife, my children, and my fortune." Well, that's how the system should work. It should be an inhibiting factor. And the fewer reporters we have around, imperfect as that system is, the more emboldened the kleptocrats are. Just yesterday, Buffalo City Hall was raided by HUD and the IRS and some other agency. And that's just because somebody tipped them off. Otherwise, they wouldn't know. So this loss of local newspapers is a real problem. When I started out in 1966 and was in high school, covering the Santa Cruz County Board of Supervisors, a county that's got 3 or 4 times the population today it had back then. Every Tuesday morning, there were either 5 or 6 reporters there. In recent years, it's 1, and if there's a big issue, 2. And that's a real loss. It's a real serious problem. And when you go up to the level now of dealing with electronic national media, Cable is not regulated. Now, I'm the only journalist in history who's gotten a broadcaster forced to go out of business and go off the air for news manipulations and blackouts. WGIM and Gross Telecasting. And Gross, according to Forbes magazine, was the second most profitable broadcaster in the country, not in dollars, but the share of revenue, and it was a profit. And today, I don't think they would lose their license for the things they did. News blackouts, news manipulations, ordering people to be made to look bad because they were in this or that political party, et cetera. I don't think that would, the government would take that case today and spend 10 years on it, as they did. It took 10 years for him to be shut down. The news in the world began 400 years ago as a way for the emerging commercial classes, the traders, the manufacturers, the bankers, to have information that insulated them from the predatory instincts of the aristocrats. It's at the same time that the Medicis invented correspondent banking, part of which is an intelligence system. You know, if you're loaning money in Italy, you don't know what's going on in Gdansk, but if you hire the right Gdansk bankers and pay them really well, they know what's going on, and they'll tell you when to make and not make a loan. And the internet has destroyed that model. It destroyed travel agency business, brought it down to nothing compared to what it was. It's had lots of benefits, but it's really destroyed the newspaper model, which was to bring buyers and sellers together inside the market, and guys like me were the barkers saying, come on in. And I don't see any way that's going to recover. And I don't blame Craig Newmark for that, with his Craigslist. I mean, he's an entrepreneur and he had a new idea, and good for him. But we have to figure out something we're going to do here. The British and the Canadians do it with publicly financed news, that they insulate from the politicians. We certainly need to debate that. But this is a real problem. Democracy won't work without information. When there are riots, one of the first things the police and the military want to do is get good information out to people, because crazy things, happen, and you want to stop that. And so they're very active in telling radio and TV more than print about what's actually happening. No, City Hall is not on fire. That's ridiculous. We're not even guarding City Hall. There's no danger to it, for example. And this is just, it's a technological problem I don't know the answer to. And we're going to have lots of those problems in the future. One of the things I taught in my regulatory classes, the day is coming, the biological age is just about here to replace the digital age. Or sometimes people prefer to call it the genetic age. And we're going to create animals that never existed. People are going to, instead of, well, this is the kid we got, are going to design their kids. They're going to go to a store called Designer Genes and design their kids. And there are going to be some disasters along the way, but it's also going to change our whole notion of things. There's been research long ago that didn't go anywhere about what if we could design a pig that didn't have those legs? It would be so inexpensive to carve it up and turn it into bacon and ham. And that's going to happen. It's just, we're making artificial meat. We're going to grow hearts for people who, our hearts are failing. And these are all challenges we have to make. And the way we meet them is we have to have time and an education that allows us to do that. And in the case of news, boy, I don't know. I'm really worried about this. I'm really worried about the failure of local democracy without it. And I don't have a solution for you about that. So thank you very much.